First, I want to pose a question to you. Can religion justify bullying children? I want you to picture yourself in a situation. Say that you are a troubled teen and you're at a so-called religious boot camp to help you reform yourself. And you are tied behind an ATV. And the ATV starts moving. And your choice is to run or be dragged. Now, this divinely inspired way to train up a child was a real situation at a so-called religious boot camp in the United States of America. And there are states in the Union that, because a so-called religious boot camp is religious, they exempt that institution from the kind of health and safety laws that would apply to a comparable secular institution. I want to give you another example. In Florida, there was a case in a similar so-called religious boot camp where children were restrained with ropes and handcuffs. And there was a grand jury investigation of this. And the pastor who ran the facility said, "This is bureaucratic harassment." Now, you might think that the elected officials, upon hearing about children, minors, being handcuffed and tied with rope, would react to protect the children. But the legislature decided differently. They decided to exempt the facility from the health and safety regulations that apply to comparable secular facilities. Think of it, a Burger King. A Burger King has to meet health and safety codes, but they said the fire inspections, the other typical inspections that you would have, would not apply to a place that's working with troubled teenagers. That was the situation in the United States of America, and continues in some states with this kind of regulatory rubric. Oh, and by the way, I'm leaving out the fact that at one of these there were allegations of sexual abuse. And I'll leave it out because that was not part of the official policy, like the handcuffs and the ropes were as part of this facility. So, can religion justify bullying children? Well, in reality, it in fact does justify it, and has been successful in doing so, and government in fact has affirmatively stepped in to facilitate this kind of bullying. Now, picture yourself as a 6-year-old child. You're on the school grounds, and another 6-year-old child comes up to you and says, "If you don't believe in Jesus Christ as your personal Savior, you will burn in hell." Now, you meet lots of kids in the schoolyard, and we all have to deal with who we deal with in life. That's how things are. But what if the child saying, "If you don't believe in Jesus, you're going to burn in hell forever," was told to say that by an adult, and the adult was an authority figure who spent time on the school campus, and that authority figure was often there during school hours, and it was the adult who said to the child, just moments after the afternoon buzzer, so it's not officially school anymore, it was that adult who said, "Not believing in Jesus Christ as your personal Savior means that you will burn in hell forever." But it gets worse. It gets worse. The adult that I'm referring to organized distribution of flyers on the school, public school campus, for a fundamentalist Christian meeting. And the flyers were distributed during school hours on this public school campus, encouraging children to attend a fundamentalist meeting. And it gets worse still. The adult is one of thousands of proselytizers funded to the tune of millions of dollars for organizations, one of the most prominent of which is so-called good news clubs. And don't think, oh, this is just something that happens in the Deep South. This is something that happens in the Northwest, the Northeast, Southern California, Midwest, all over the United States as part of a concerted and organized effort. in taxpayer-funded American public schools, because they always say, oh, it's right after the buzzer when these actual statements are made, so it's not during school hours. But the kids, understandably, draw reasonable conclusions. Reasonable conclusions like, Jew, you will burn in hell forever because you don't accept Jesus Christ as your personal Savior. You don't believe in God, you'll burn in hell forever because you don't accept Jesus Christ as your personal Savior. The wrong type of Protestant, burn in hell forever because you haven't accepted Jesus Christ as your personal Savior. Now, what kind of good news is that? One might ask. But the question that I come back to is, can religion justify bullying children? It can, and it does, all the time, with government help. And when I say with government help in this context, I want you to understand that our taxpayer-funded American schools are falling down on the job. They're not doing what they can legally do to keep church and state separate. They could legally prohibit flyers being distributed for religious meetings on the school campus, but oftentimes that is not done. They should require clear notice to parents and children about the existence and the nature of these type of religious events. And there should be a prohibition on statements that can lead to bullying types of activities between children. This is American tax dollars at work, and they should be responsibly used in our American public schools. And this kind of bullying can undermine a school's culture. There was one instance of a student losing her place in the school basketball team because she ignored the coach's order to participate in a pregame prayer. Another school nurse confronted a student in the hallway because the student wasn't participating in a club, the goal of which was to, quote, create a Christian influence in our schools. The culture of schools matters, and these so-called good news clubs affect the culture of American public schools to a very significant degree. Let me give you another example. It's been said that pain is a marvelous purifier. Now, these are not the words of some masochist or sadist. They're the words of James Dobson, one of the most powerful religious leaders in modern America. And when Dobson says, and I'm quoting, pain is a marvelous purifier, he means pain for children, explicitly. Mr. Dobson asserts, and I'm quoting, spanking should be of sufficient magnitude to cause the child to cry genuinely. And then Dobson advocates spanking children as young as 18 months. Dobson's focus on the family organization has an annual budget of over $100 million a year. Their goal, their express goal, is to affect American government and public policy. Mr. Dobson further states that if a child cries for more than 5 minutes, quote, the child is merely complaining, and, quote, I would require him to stop the protest crying, usually by offering him a little more of whatever caused the original tears. Close quote from James Dobson. Another prominent fundamentalist, author Michael Pearl. Now, you might think this guy is out to lunch, except that he sold 1.5 million copies of his book on child rearing. Books that find their way into the hands of fundamentalist parents, fundamentalist homeschoolers, and fundamentalist schools. Pearl specifically states, regarding child discipline, and I'm quoting, a length of quarter-inch plumbing supply line is a real attention getter, close quote. It certainly got some attention when a 7-year-old girl died in 2010 after an apparent repeated beating with a quarter-inch plumbing supply line. Another child died from injuries from a quarter-inch plumbing supply line in 2004. Now, most Christians don't support corporal punishment, certainly not of this type. But 66% of fundamentalist Protestants believe that corporal punishment should be allowed in schools. a couple of million children, actually more than a couple of million children, go to some form of fundamentalist education in the United States of America. The vast majority of Christian schools are exempt from laws prohibiting corporal punishment. Remember what Dobson said. Remember what Pearl said. And their ideas and their books are pervasive in the fundamentalist world. Christian schools, however, get millions of your dollars, your tax dollars, through textbook subsidies, through transportation subsidies, for reimbursement, for mandated resources for the school. Now, most states prohibit corporal punishment in public schools, but only 2 states do so in private schools, and it is private fundamentalist schools that most often authorize corporal punishment. The government is authorizing the use of physical violence as a form of punishment for a specific set of children, and doing so with our tax money. Children in religious schools are no less human. They are no less deserving of safety from physical harm than any other category of children. Whatever your thinking is on physical punishment, one way or the other, religion itself should not be the justification for any different standard. So, can religion justify bullying children? Remember Pearl's plumbing supply line. Remember Dobson's words. Pain is a marvelous purifier. Think of this. How does it feel to be a child in a religious school funded with vouchers, tax money? Say you are an African American child in an inner city school in Washington, D.C., where vouchers are often prevalent. And say you happen to be that so-called nerdy kid, you know, the one who has a spark of interest in science. You admire the space program. You admire Neil Armstrong and Neil deGrasse Tyson. You imagine yourself with Einstein, imagining yourself on that beam of light. You aspire to be a skeptical and analytical thinker. Yet in this taxpayer-funded school, there is an official policy to make, and I quote, warriors for Christ, close quote. Not peacemakers for Buddha, not explorers for science, warriors for Christ. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, spoke against the tyranny of the majority. The greatest tyranny is against the mind of a child who is cowed by a closed-minded majority. Can religion justify the bullying of children who have different views and independent views? Religion does so. And government steps in, and with your voucher tax dollars, it helps subsidize it. Now, what about private religious schools that aren't so private because they get the transportation subsidies oftentimes, they get the textbook subsidies, they get the mandated program reimbursement? What about those schools? Well, 1 million children or more are in fundamentalist homeschooling in the United States today. 1 million minds that have an instinct to learn. What happens to those 1 million minds? Over 1.5 million children in America go to fundamentalist schools outside the home. As I said, your tax money often helps fund those schools. Now, listen to religious school expert James Dwyer, who says fundamentalist schools often operate, and I quote, in secrecy and isolation from the larger community. And it's even more isolating and even more secret in fundamentalist homeschooling situation. And what is taught in those schools? What are 2.5 million American children today being taught? Well, June of 2012, we celebrate the 40th anniversary of Title IX, which requires education equity for women and girls in education. The law became controversial, as most of us know, because of its application to sports. But what wasn't particularly controversial, even back in 1972, was academic equity for women and girls. But there is a provision in Title IX that exempts schools with a sexist religious ideology from the rules of Title IX. As religious school expert James Dwyer writes, quote, "Fundamentalist Christian schools of all kinds explicitly inculcate sexist views and aggressively discourage girls from pursuing any ambition in life other than serving a husband." Close quote. Talk about being bullied by teachers, by the administrators of the school, by the authority figures in your life. Over 1 million girls are taught in fundamentalist schools, raised up in fundamentalist schools in this country today, not 40, 50 years ago, today. And then think about the boys. Think about the boys in these schools as well. There are good-hearted, well-intentioned boys who are instinctively fair-minded. But what does it do to those boys when they are taught day in and day out that women shall be submissive, that girls shall be submissive to the man? How does it affect their thinking and their minds for the rest of their lives? But the bullying is not just limited to sexism. Fundamentalist schools often teach a curriculum called accelerated Christian education. Here's some examples of this curriculum. That the Constitution's framers were Theocrats, and then, get this one, that the South fought the Civil War to preserve its Protestant identity, and then that slavery is consistent with the Bible. Now, admittedly, that one's true, but it's implied to these 2.5 million plus children that this biblical justification is somehow exculpatory. Can religion justify bullying of children? Yes. Yes, it can. In the case of 2.5 million children, children who are abandoned. These children are abandoned by the government to a bullying and sexist viewpoint that is ahistorical and anti-science. Remember, this is a system where teachers most often aren't even certified. So don't let them fool you, by the way, when they say this is somehow part of some constitutional religious liberty. That is a lie. The Supreme Court has been very clear. Just as the government, on behalf of society, can say we're going to regulate a manufacturer where only adults are going to work, the Supreme Court has been clear that the state has even more of an interest, the citizens of this country have even more of an interest in making sure that children get a decent education, whether it's public school or private school. No. This situation is the result of politicians succumbing to lobbying, particularly in the 1980s when there was a wildfire of laws that exempted from teacher certification private schools in this country to the benefit of religious schools. Now, I want you to imagine that you were a child in a small town in Texas going to a public school. The fundamentalist Christian bullies on the statewide Texas school board removed from Texas textbooks the scientific consensus about the origin of our universe because it contradicted the book of Genesis. They did that in a taxpayer-funded textbook. They also said in the textbook that America's founding documents in our Constitution were based on biblical law, and especially Mosaic law, except that Stephen K. Green of the Center for Religion, Law, and Democracy says that, in fact, the record of the founders, and I'm quoting, the record is basically bereft of the founding fathers referring to Mosaic or biblical law in the founding of our republic. But it's in the Texas textbooks. The state school board treats Texas children as vessels into which they pour their religious ideology with taxpayer dollars. But it gets even worse because of how textbooks are purchased. See, Texas is the largest market. New York, California don't purchase statewide in the same way as Texas does. So Texas is the largest market, and the textbook publishers often publish their books to meet the needs of the largest market. So children outside of Texas are having these textbooks imposed on them as well. What happens to a child? Think of that child in a small Texas town, that independent thinking child. If this is what the Texas statewide school board will do, Think about being an independent-minded child in some small town in Texas where fundamentalism dominates your community. What if you speak out for the truth about the origin of the universe? What if you speak out for the truth about what our founders said? Can religion justify bullying of children who take a principled stand, an honest stand? Yes. Yes, it does. And it does with the government having a hand in what is happening. Now picture yourself being a girl who is subject to sex trafficking. The estimate was there's 14,000 women or girls who've been involved in trafficking, most of them as sex workers. Think about the situation for these girls, and they often are girls, who are sometimes beaten, sometimes raped, can't speak English much of the time, sometimes contract HIV. And what did the bishops say? What did the hierarchy of the Catholic Church say? They wanted the tax money, but they wanted to refuse someone like that, a child victim of rape, reproductive services in their desperate kind of situation. See, the archbishops, they wanted these girls to bow low before the authority of the Catholic hierarchy, despite the fact that the vast majority of Catholic Americans support contraception. That's the situation in the United States today, and they want our tax money to do it. Can religion justify bullying children? It does, time and time again in our society, with government involvement and help. Picture yourself being a Boy Scout. In our society, being a Boy Scout is something that's encouraged at school. It's encouraged by your friends. It's encouraged by your aunts and uncles and family members, and understandably so. There's great experiences to be had in the scouting world. But now picture yourself, you're a young man, you go through scouting, and you do an excellent job. There was a young man named Neil Polzin, and he just rose up through the ranks of the Scouts. He became an Eagle Scout. In fact, it sounds like a corny movie, but one time someone fell into a ravine in a remote area, and Neil scrambled down into the ravine and kept this person who was injured stable while they got a helicopter to medevac this person out to safety. And he did that for several hours based upon his scout training. He continued to rise through the ranks in the Scouts, and as an adult, he became an employee of the Scouts. And then, on top of that, they said that he, in his commendations, was the best aquatic instructor on the entire west coast of the United States of America. So Neil said to himself one day, you know, I have this call to conscience, and I have to say that in my heart, I don't happen to believe in God. And Neil, with this perfect record, hugely commendable record, was fired. Because the Scouts get your tax money, they get it directly and indirectly, but they expressly discriminate based on religion or against people who are not religious, because this young man thinks the same way as Warren Buffett, thinks the same way as George Clooney. He was fired. He was fired. And watch out if you're gay, because if you happen to be like Barney Frank and say so, you're thrown out of the Scouts. That's what happened. The Girl Scouts, by the way, do not do this. They do not discriminate in that fashion. But the Boy Scouts do, and they get our tax money while they're doing it. And what happens in society? A lot of Scouts and a lot of parents who want them to have the scouting experience, of course, and even understandably, they lie. A lot of them. They lie about something that is important to them as a person. But should it be permitted that a child who happens to make the decision to be open and show their integrity about who they are and what they believe should be thrown out of the Scouts, an organization that wants our tax dollars and gets them? So the question again, can religion justify the bullying of children? Think about the boys who are cowed into silence within the scouting world. In a video that we have on YouTube where I'm introducing Richard Dawkins at Lynchburg, Virginia, I tell the story of a 15-year-old girl who had a tumor on her shoulder. She was in a faith-healing home. And because her parents didn't believe in modern medical treatment, she ended up having this tumor grow to hideous size, horrible, torturous pain, and then she died. that happened to this girl. And I go into rather excruciating detail about what happened to this girl's body and how painful it was before she died. And in one way you can say, oh, this is just an anecdote. This is just a story, except that this one 15-year-old girl is representative of so many others. Representative of those, only a few of whom die, but many suffer horrible, agonizing pain. I interviewed a woman named Liz Haywood about faith healing. It's on YouTube. You can see it and see her interview. She describes her childhood. She's an adult now. And when she was about 15, her great hobby was riding horses. And she got an infection in her leg in this faith healing home. And they ended up putting a cookie tray underneath her leg so the pus would run out of her leg. She screamed in horrible, agonizing pain. Eventually, the bone fused at the joint. And later, as an adult, her leg was amputated. So she didn't die. But the trauma, the incredible trauma, lasts a lifetime. And in American law, 38 states provide a more lenient standard. I used to serve as an assistant attorney general for a brief time, handling child protection cases. And in medical neglect, they have the separate standard in most states that gives more leeway. It doesn't make it legal, but it gives more leeway to the so-called strict faith healing homes. But of course, if it was faith healing, I'd be for it. It's faith harming and often faith killing. That's the situation. And yet, the minister can correctly say to members of their congregation, hey, there's a more lenient standard for us when encouraging people to engage in this horrifying practice with their children. That happens in America today. It is the label of religion that is used to justify so much of this behavior. Religious bullying of children with the imprimatur of American law. It is time and time again that government steps in to be involved. You know, there are those who say, I bet many of you have heard this, how can you be moral without religion? But I bet those very same people would be so offended if one were to ask the question, how can you be moral and be religious? But aren't both questions equally valid or invalid? But what I would say is a valid point of inquiry is about this religious justification of the bullying of children. Because I've said, yes, it is justified in reality, in an evidence-based world. It has been justified time and time again, but it is only a political justification for the bullying of children. It can never be a moral justification for the bullying of children. So where is religious morality now? You know, religion is the get out of morality free card. Religion is the get out of responsibility free card. Now, there are people who make wrong choices who are secular, but you don't get to go to a state legislature and say, I waive my lack of religion, pass a special law so I can do something that's incredibly heinous. But time and time again, legislatures pass laws at the behest of religion that have viciously immoral consequences, and legislatures rush to do what they are told by religious authorities in this regard. In my book, I offer a 10-point vision of a secular America. One prong of that vision is that children are human beings and are to be treated with human rights. It doesn't matter the religion of that child's parent or school or child care center. There should be one consistent standard for the health and welfare of children under American law. And a second prong of the 10-point vision of a secular America that you can see at richarddawkins.net is that there not be any religious bias in American education. And these two principles that I offer in my book are only 2 of 10 of this vision of a secular America. You can see them on the YouTube video, my new strategy video. And what we seek to do with this is to offer not only a positive vision, which I offer in this book, of what a secular America would be, a moral vision of what a secular America would be, but I offer the most specific strategic plan offered to date about how we can get to a secular America. From my 10 years of experience in elective office, my 4 years of experience lobbying at the state and federal level, and my years and years of political and grassroots organizing. We need to have a strategy. That's what I offer in my book. These issues that I've described for children are critically important, but they are only a part of the picture. Only a part of the picture of the injustices that we see in society based on religious bias in law. It's wrong. It's wrong if someone on an individual basis is mean or inappropriate based on a religion or any other factor. But what's even more wrong, and what I document in my book, is when government steps in to allow for this or gives official imprimatur for this, and that's what we're seeing. And I am pledging to you that with the Richard Dawkins Foundation, our foundation and I individually, I am devoting myself to this cause, and I'm asking each and every one of you in this room to devote a part of your day, a part of your efforts, a part of your money to this cause, which is supporting the founding values of Jefferson and Madison, the founding values of our republic. And I guarantee you, I want to see a secular policy effort in every single state of the Union, and I'm going to go there. I don't care if it's Alaska, Florida, Maine, Hawaii, any place in between. We're going to work with each and every one of you to make this happen, because it is our patriotic duty to get it done. And I say to religious people, good. Religious people, you say you are moral. I reach out a hand in friendship to you, and I say you join us, because we, secular Americans, are taking the moral high ground about protection of children, and we welcome you to join us on the moral high ground, because that is where we stand. I challenge religious people to join us and say that we will stop this religiously justified bullying via corporal punishment, that we will fight against unregulated religious boot camps, that we will fight to stop sexist bullying in religious schools, that we will do everything we can to stop this torture-filled bullying of so-called faith healing, that we will fight against all the injustices I describe here and that are addressed by the 10-point vision in my book, that together we can do this. Because I say, you know, if somebody takes away your human rights because they get to waive a 2,000-year-old document, well, that is wrong. But to say you can bully or harm a child because of a 2,000-year-old document is hideous and immoral, and it must end. And I am asking each and every one of you to stand up for this secular vision of what America can be. I believe, I'm a patriot, and I believe America and its founding values, its protection of minority rights, are great and historic, but we will be even greater when we restore the founding values of this republic through a sense of compassion for our fellow citizens. And we don't let our sense of compassion be limited by some ancient document. Our sense of compassion and justice knows no restriction, and I'm ready to stand and work with you to change America and make it a better place. Thanks so much for taking the time.